Chinese authorities covered up the coronavirus at a time when millions were traveling. A wave of xenophobia and racism is sweeping China. And should the US and China cooperate to fight the coronavirus? This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Guess what? According to internal government documents leaked to the Associated Press, the Chinese Communist Party knew before January 14th that they had a deadly epidemic on their hands, and they didn't warn the public for 6 days. Now let me clarify. I'm not talking about small-time local officials in Wuhan where the coronavirus outbreak began. I'm talking about the very top level of the Chinese Communist Party. On January 14th, the National Health Commission held a teleconference with provincial health authorities. The teleconference was held to convey instructions on the coronavirus from President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Keqiang, and Vice Premier Sun Chunlan. So yeah, Xi Jinping and other top leaders knew before January 14th, but Xi didn't warn the public about the epidemic until January 20th. During that time, Communist authorities allowed officials in Wuhan, the epicenter of the disease they knew about, to hold a mass banquet for tens of thousands of people while millions began traveling through for Lunar New Year celebrations. Even though an internal government memo from January 14th said that with the coming of the Spring Festival, many people will be traveling and the risk of transmission and spread is high. All localities must prepare for and respond to a pandemic. Meanwhile, Chinese health officials were telling the public they weren't likely to get infected by other people.
At present, we have reached the latest understanding that the risk of sustained human-to-human transmission is low.
So privately, officials were saying that the risk of transmission and spread was high, while publicly saying it was low. And the World Health Organization helped the Communist Party cover it up by tweeting, "Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission." Meanwhile, inside China, where doctors were seeing human-to-human transmission, those who tried to raise a warning were ignored and, at worst, crushed. Doctors in Wuhan were afraid. It was truly intimidation of an entire profession. So why did the party let thousands of people get sick while they tried to keep it quiet? According to that government memo from January 14th, authorities were worried about political stability. The memo demanded officials unite around Xi and made clear that political considerations and social stability were key priorities during the long lead-up to China's two biggest political meetings of the year in March, which it turns out they had to cancel anyway because they let the coronavirus become a pandemic. That's called stupid with Chinese characteristics. So the Chinese Communist Party let the coronavirus spread around China and the world because they didn't want to lose their grip on power, which is why the coronavirus is truly the CCP virus. But there's one group the Chinese Communist Party can't seem to intimidate: meme creators, at least the ones in Thailand. A famous Thai actor who goes by the name Bright retweeted a photo of Hong Kong last week that referred to it as a country. His Chinese fans were very upset, and he later posted an apology. And peace was restored to the internet for one hot second. Then his girlfriend, who calls herself New, retweeted a popular COVID-19 conspiracy theory that China invented the virus in a lab in Wuhan. Uh-oh. Chinese netizens then found this old exchange between the two. Basically, it was a photo of New in Taiwan, and Bright said she looked like a cute Chinese girl. She corrected him, cute Taiwanese girl. And a meme war began. My favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, decided it was their job to jump into the Twitter dumpster fire. They published a hit piece on Bright's newest TV show, basically suggesting that Chinese people boycott it. An army of Chinese nationalists also made their way to Twitter, which is blocked in China, to demand a public apology from New. Now normally, this kind of onslaught is enough to make even the biggest, most powerful corporations in the world crack. Like that time Mercedes-Benz pathetically apologized to China after an Instagram post quoting the Dalai Lama. But in Thailand, Thai trolls showed they could go toe-to-toe with China's Wu Mao, the 50-cent army, who get paid to post pro-Communist Party messaging on the internet. Here are some of my favorites. But perhaps most impressive is the Virgin Wu Mao and the Chad Thai, which just shows you the might of the Thai people. You see, Chad Thais don't care when the Wu Mao criticize the Thai government because Chad Thais also criticize their own government. But it didn't even stop there. Now, Hong Kong and Taiwan are joining forces with Thailand to further burn the Chinese Communist Party. A Taiwanese mayor said, "Thank you, our friends from Thailand. Thailand has long been a popular travel destination for the Taiwanese. We look forward to increased exchanges after the COVID-19 outbreak." Hong Kong protest leader Joshua Wong called for an alliance between Hong Kongers and Taiwanese to support Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam to fight Chinese environmental destruction. Some are calling it the Milk Tea Alliance. And can I just say, after months covering a deadly pandemic, it's nice to finally have a story bring a smile to my face. You know, I'm not putting that thing away, because get a load of this next story. The Chinese Communist Party has asked the Wisconsin State Senate to praise them. Wisconsin Senate President Roger Roth received 2 emails from Chinese consulate staff asking that he pass a resolution they wrote supporting China's battle against COVID-19, praising China's response to the virus. Here's the resolution that the Chinese consulate wrote. You might recognize some familiar propaganda, like the idea that China was transparent and quick in sharing key information, thus creating a window of opportunity for other countries. What did Roth do? He put together his own resolution. It starts out by acknowledging that the Communist Party of China deliberately and intentionally misled the world on the Wuhan coronavirus, and by standing in solidarity with the Chinese people to condemn the actions of the Communist Party of China. Along the way, he manages to work in references to the Communist Party's human rights abuses, including Tibet, Uyghur concentration camps, forced abortions and sterilizations, forced organ harvesting, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and religious persecution. He's not quite a Thai memester, but I gotta say, I like the guy. And coming up after the break, China has accused the US of racism in handling the coronavirus. But just wait till you see what authorities are doing to black people inside China. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. When the Chinese Communist Party unleashed the deadly coronavirus pandemic upon the world, do you remember what their response was? Calling the US racist for saying it started in China. Chinese media wrote that some American officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, are using Wuhan virus, which is considered a racist term. Thank you, Global Times. You truly are my favorite state-run media. Yes, according to the Global Times, anyone who says Wuhan virus is racist, which includes, plot twist, the Global Times. I mean, that's why I started calling it the CCP virus. I'm not racist. In fact, party mouthpiece Xinhua said racism is actually worse than the coronavirus. Back in February, Chinese state-run media was saying the US travel ban on people who had recently been in China was an anti-China action, and all countries should lift travel restrictions. Fast forward to the end of March, and China put in place its own travel ban, one that's way more restrictive than anything the US did. Because for China, it doesn't matter which country you've recently been in, as long as you're ethnically a foreigner, China has now banned you from entering the country. You might think that's hypocritical, but you see, it isn't. When the Chinese government uses travel restrictions to stop the spread of the coronavirus they caused, that's necessary. When the US does it to stop the spread of the coronavirus the Chinese government caused, that's racist. When they do it, it's fine. When America does it, it's racist, obviously. In a recent Foreign Ministry press briefing, a reporter from state-run Xinhua News asked, "There have been reports of some foreigners complaining about discrimination and rising xenophobia in China. Do you have any comment?" And the Foreign Ministry spokesman said, "China opposes all forms of discrimination and prejudice." Cue the racial purge.
A large number of African people in the southern Chinese city Guangzhou were driven out by their landlords and had to stay on the streets. Another video shows many Africans dragging their luggage aimlessly through the streets of Guangzhou. One of them says, "We are just walking on the road. They can't give us a house, they can't give us a hotel, and they cannot provide a place we can stay."
And how did the Chinese authorities respond to a bunch of evicted Africans walking down the street? By sending the police to follow and harass them. There are even reports of authorities taking away their passports. There is literally nowhere for these people to go.
Nigerians in China are suffering. They are suffering well. Nigerians in China. Child, it's a pity, it's a pity, it's a pity. Nigeria in China is suffering. It's a pity. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
Now, while there are definitely examples of people in America being xenophobic against Chinese people,
every disease has ever came from China. It's disgusting.
what's happening in Guangzhou is racial discrimination by the government itself.
Huddled on cobbled streets with layers of clothing to generate heat under the cold skies of Wanzhou city, this is the new way of life for Africans living in China. Africans have become subjects of racial profiling. Chinese nationals blame them for the rising number of new coronavirus cases in the country.
Although it's not limited to the government either. A McDonald's franchise in Guangzhou posted this notice saying that black people are not allowed to enter the restaurant. McDonald's Corporation was not happy about what that franchise owner did, and they shut them down temporarily. Now, it is true that in the Guangzhou district known as Little Africa, 16 people have tested positive for the CCP virus. But 16? That's not a lot. More cases might come to light, but the reason there's a second wave of the coronavirus in China is because of the Chinese Communist Party's continued cover-up and forcing people to go back to work. It's not because of a small number of African immigrants, no matter how much they try to blame it on them. For more on that, check out our episode, China May See a Second Wave of Infections. There are now instances of what Chinese authorities are calling imported cases of the coronavirus. But 90% of those were Chinese passport holders returning to China, according to China's foreign ministry. Despite facts, there's been reports of more and more anti-foreigner sentiment in China, particularly against black people who are seen as diseased rapists.
国内目前的外国人给大家的印象并不是很好，像新闻总会爆出来很多黑人强奸啊这种事件。我不是针对这一个种族。
嗰啲客人咧玩咗嗰個女仔，個女仔有艾滋病，佢又玩咗另一個女大學生，個女大學生又有艾滋病。
This is not too surprising in a country where there's a commercial of a Chinese woman washing a black man with such a powerful laundry detergent that he becomes Chinese. Here are particularly classy comments from Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter. Blacks are the most inferior race. I don't even know why people see them as humans. Can our country expel the blacks? Yes, I'm racist. They're ugly and have no quality. No matter what race, black or white, Chinese are superior. Wrong is wrong. We won't discriminate and look down on others. Wow. The Chinese version of Twitter is even more of a dumpster fire than regular Twitter. But these are just comments and actions from individuals. And there are racist people in every country, especially internet country. But in China, instead of there being laws to protect people against racist policies or attacks, the Chinese Communist Party and the government are totally cool with it. They actually create racist policies. For example, black residents in Guangzhou are being forced to remain inside their apartments even if they have not traveled anywhere that would warrant a quarantine and submit to coronavirus tests. It's not about where you've been, it's about what you look like. Chinese authorities did the same thing back in 2009 during the swine flu outbreak that started in Mexico. China was quarantining all Mexicans even if they hadn't been to Mexico. Sure, it's racist, but at least Chinese authorities are consistent. Xenophobic attitudes are only getting worse as the Chinese Communist Party tries to blame the coronavirus on foreigners. Throughout China, there are reports of businesses closing their doors to foreign friends. Though, hashtag not all Chinese. Here's a woman slamming authorities for, as they say, just following orders.
全部黑人隔离。全部黑人隔离，华人呢？白人呢？为什么你们不隔离他们呀？你们换位思考一下，我们中国同胞也有在国外的，也有在非洲的。如果这个事情传出去，你想我们的同胞在那边会怎么样？你们没想过这个问题？已经讲。我知道哈，你们是按章办事，这个我很理解。我们都是按照上级的要求来做的。
We're just doing our job. There's an argument that has never been used to justify anything bad before. But that woman was right. The Chinese Communist Party has been investing heavily in Africa as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or as it's been called, colonialism with Chinese characteristics. Many African leaders have been eager to get Chinese money for their countries, or for themselves and their cronies. But this persecution of African nationals inside China is putting the Communist Party's Africa plans in jeopardy. A Nigerian official confronted their Chinese ambassador about it. So did the president of the African Union, who is probably already a little upset at the Chinese Communist Party for that time they spied on the African Union for 5 years. In response to these complaints from African nations, Chinese diplomats denied everything. And now that this issue has become a major diplomatic mess for the Chinese Communist Party, they're promising equal treatment for Africans. But in a country where just 3 months ago, Chinese media denied the coronavirus could be spread human to human, there's only one thing you can trust: that Chinese officials are lying. Which is exactly why the US and China should cooperate. Or at least, that's what Chinese officials are saying. And if you're wondering why the US should cooperate with a bunch of liars, stay tuned after the break. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The coronavirus, or the Chinese Communist Party virus, continues to spread across China and around the world. But you know who's doing a great job handling it? The Chinese Communist Party. Now sure, their terrifying authoritarian crackdown on Chinese citizens has not actually stopped the spread of the virus. Which is weird, because you'd think beating people up and shoving them into boxes would be the perfect solution. But what the Chinese Communist Party is good at is changing the narrative. Over the past 3 months, the party's narrative has shifted constantly, from a cover-up to a battle to blaming other countries, even claiming that the US Army started the coronavirus epidemic. And now that the coronavirus outbreak is really bad in the US, the Chinese Communist Party is spinning a new narrative. The US and China must cooperate. What does cooperation mean? Well, this open letter signed by 100 Chinese scholars says that countries should be working together, not complaining, finger-pointing, and blaming one another. Yes, countries should not say, for example, that the coronavirus started in China. Because really, cooperation is more important than truth. But it's not just Chinese scholars calling for cooperation. This open letter signed by 90 prominent Americans says, "We, the undersigned, believe that the logic for cooperation is compelling." The undersigned include Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State for Bill Clinton, Stephen Hadley, the National Security Advisor under George W. Bush, and Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor under Obama. They write, "No effort against the coronavirus will be successful without some degree of cooperation between the United States and China." Now sure, cooperation sounds good. After all, since we were kids, we've been told to share and cooperate and work together. Which I told Mrs. Enfield was a bunch of commie garbage, and I am a free American. She put me in a timeout. Filthy commie. But the idea of the US-China cooperation that China is presenting is not actually about unselfish teamwork. US-China cooperation is the party line, straight from the Chinese regime. We know this because it's been pushed by Chinese state-run media. Fighting COVID-19 requires international cooperation, and Xi Jinping and his unremitting call for global health cooperation, and China calls for G20 cooperation. The Communist Party's call for cooperation has political reasons behind it, and that starts to become clear if you read this op-ed in the New York Times written by China's ambassador to the US, titled, "China and the US Must Cooperate Against Coronavirus." The Chinese ambassador writes that at a time when solidarity is essential, we need to keep cool heads and clearly say no to the folly of fanning racism and xenophobia and to scapegoating other countries or races. So now that we all agree we have to cooperate, that means don't blame the Chinese Communist Party for a so-called cover-up. That would be racism and xenophobia. But the Chinese ambassador's message went further. See, we need more than just the spirit of not blaming each other. To fight this deadly virus, we must also explore the sharing of pharmaceutical technologies among nations and keep the global industrial and supply chains open. There, those two things he's saying we need to keep doing, those are precisely the things the Chinese Communist Party is afraid of losing. First, over the last couple decades, American drug makers have gradually outsourced their manufacturing and technology to China. Today, the vast majority of generic drugs Americans use are made in Chinese factories. But now, US officials are worried about Chinese control of America's drug supply. Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, said this means the Chinese regime could potentially weaponize our medicines, and that the US should resume making drug ingredients at home. And even the White House is talking about this now. So from the Communist Party's perspective, of course we should explore the sharing of pharmaceutical technologies among nations. Second, the ambassador's comment about keeping the global industrial and supply chains open. That doesn't come from nowhere either. The pandemic is already accelerating America's push to move manufacturing and supply chains out of China. And it's not just America. Other countries are talking about moving supply chains out of China too, like Canada and Europe. Europe's a country. You see, without foreign direct investment, China's economy will be in big trouble. So when the Chinese regime calls for cooperation, it's not in the spirit of teamwork and fighting the virus. Remember, just a few weeks ago, they were trying to blame the US military. China's cooperation means cooperation on their terms. It's a tactic to avoid blame from the rest of the world, especially the US. Chinese diplomat Chen Yongling, who's now a defector living in Australia, explained this tactic in a recent phone interview with NTD.
Before, when I worked for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, we called it two-handed or dual tactics. We always used two-handed tactics to deal with the US. Deng Xiaoping said you need to hide your strength, bide your time. You need to struggle with the enemy, but also cooperate. It's a contradiction. But you need to take advantage of this contradiction and constantly adjust your strategy. Sometimes cooperate more, sometimes fight more. Don't fight out in the open, fight in secret.
So the Chinese regime is now fighting in secret, while at the same time calling for cooperation. Like how it had its state-run media accuse the US of being racist and blaming the US military for starting the coronavirus. But at the same time, it's saying we should not point fingers. Instead, China and the US need to cooperate. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't mean they want to cooperate with the US. They mean they want the US to cooperate with them on their terms, which means they keep lying and cheating, and the US keeps giving them technology and money. This is called win-win mutual cooperation, with Chinese characteristics. And that's it for this week's China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.